Welcome everyone to the EDF. All right, I'll start now. Welcome everyone to the EDF Economics seminar series. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank Reed Walker for agreeing to present his very relevant, I would say policy relevant, and then also very novel economics contribution. So I want to thank Reed for that. And I also want to thank Hillary Collins and then Takolo Matsubu for helping set up this talk. So just a short introduction for Reed. So Reed Walker is the Transamerica Professor of Business Strategy at the Haas School of Business and Public Policy at UC Berkeley. He also is an Associate Professor of Economics at Berkeley. And I've been following Reed's work for a long time, and he is definitely at the top of the list when it comes to air quality policy in research. So I want to give as much time as I can to Reed, so I won't steal any thunder. Reed, thanks, and please start whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks. Thanks for having me. It's good to see some familiar faces, and it's always a pleasure to present at EDF. This is a project that I'm going to talk about that's joint work with Joe Shapiro, who's a colleague here at Berkeley. It's really a series of projects. The first project is, the title here is a little bit self-explanatory. We're basically just trying to ask whether or not existing US air quality regulations are too stringent or not stringent enough. And fortunately, economics has a lot to say about that. If you go all the way back to kind of Econ 101, when we think about what's the optimal level of air pollution in society, it's typically not zero because economics recognizes that we receive lots of benefits with the ability to pollute. I mean, I'm just thinking, like sitting here around me, I have a mug that was produced in a kiln. That kiln produced air pollution as a byproduct. If we were to regulate pollution all the way down to zero, we may be foregoing lots of benefits that we as society receive. So what the right level of air pollution is, at least according to economics, is where the benefits and cost of emissions are equal. And what I mean by that is if you think about an additional unit of pollution reduction, that imposes some cost on firms in terms of compliance cost, but it also provides benefits to us as society. The air that we breathe is cleaner. We have reductions in mortality and or morbidity. And what economics would say is the right level of regulation is where those benefits and cost are equal at the margin. So for example, if we were thinking about the existing air quality regulations and whether or not they're too stringent or not stringent enough, we would want to ask ourselves, well, if we were to regulate and reduce emissions just a little bit, say by 1 ton, what are those costs? If the costs are like $1 billion a ton and the benefits of improved air quality are say $100 a ton, then that's a trade-off that I think a lot of us would not be in favor of making. On the other hand, if the benefits of reducing air pollution just a little bit are much, much larger than the cost, then that would suggest that regulation is not stringent enough. We could basically continue to ratchet down standards, improve air quality, gain lots of benefits in terms of improved health and well-being at relatively little cost. Now, the reason that we're asking this question really stems from the fact that air pollution, criteria air pollution, this is air pollution that is harmful to breathe and leads to increased respiratory illness, is incredibly important. Some people have suggested that 5% of premature US mortality can be traced back to one single air pollutant, small fine particulates. But another reason that we're asking this question is because US ambient air quality has improved dramatically over the past 50 years. If you look at ambient concentrations in the air that we breathe of regulated pollutants like fine small particulates or nitrogen dioxide, sulfur dioxides, and so on and so forth, those concentrations have fallen by, in some cases, 80 to 90% relative to their 1970 levels. Now, you then kind of start to scratch your head and wonder, like, well, is it worth it to go from 97% reductions to 98% reductions, especially when you start thinking about the increasing cost associated with compliance with these air quality regulations? Is that last 1% improvement in air quality worth it relative to the cost? And that's really what this paper is about. And this isn't just an academic debate, this is a debate that's ongoing in public policy circles all over the place. Some people suggesting that the US air quality regulations for criteria air pollutants, things like ozone, are not stringent enough, whereas others suggest that they're too stringent. The way that we're going to study this question is by studying the Clean Air Act. And so a little bit of background is necessary. Way back when the Clean Air Act was first started and promulgated in 1970, it set up a regulatory program that looks very similar to the regulatory program that exists today. And the way that this program works is it sets ambient air quality standards for different pollutants that are harmful to breathe and monitors air quality with a system of monitors throughout the United States. And if a given monitor for a given pollutant in a given area exceeds these regulatory standards, then the EPA designates that area as non-attainment for the standard. And non-attainment means lots of different things, but for the purposes of this study, what non-attainment means is that it basically sets a cap on stationary source emissions in that area. And so there can be no increases in stationary source like factory emissions in that area when these non-attainment designations go into place. Now, what that means is that if I'm a steel plant, say, for example, that wants to locate in Berkeley, I can't locate in Berkeley unless I can find some willing counterparty in Alameda County or the Bay Area who's willing to permanently reduce their emissions, sell me those emissions rights so that there is no net increase in emissions in the Bay Area non-attainment region. So that type of bilateral negotiation and transaction occurs very regularly throughout the United States and has led to the creation of hundreds of decentralized bilateral markets for pollution emissions that differ by pollutant and by location and by year. So for example, there is an emissions market or an offset market for particulate matter in the Bay Area. There's also a nitrogen dioxide offset market in the Bay Area. There's a nitrogen dioxide offset market in Houston, and so on and so forth. These are really the first environmental markets that ever existed, I think, in the world. They've been around since the mid-70s and have received relatively, I'd say, little attention from economists. And part of the goal of this paper is to kind of shed a bit more light and data on these markets because they're incredibly important for firms operating in the US today. So as I alluded to, there's almost over 600 offset markets in the US today, covering about 65% of the US population lives in one of these regions that has an existing offset market. Now, the reason that these offset markets are important, at least for our study, is that they tell us something about the marginal compliance costs that firms face when entering these markets. So for example, if I'm a steel plant and I want to locate in Berkeley, and let's say I'm a steel plant that emits 100 tons of particulate matter, that means that I need to find someone in the Bay Area that's willing to sell me 100 tons of the rights to emit particulate matter by permanently reducing their own emissions of particulate matter. If the market price for particulate matter permits or offsets is $1,000 a ton, but I know that there's some technology out there I can install at my steel plant for $100 a ton, I'm going to continue to install that technology or abatement technology to reduce my emissions up until the point where it's no longer cost effective for me to invest in pollution abatement. And then I'm just going to buy permits for the rest of those emissions. And similarly, on the supply side, if I'm an incumbent operating in the Bay Area and I see these permits trading for, say, $5,000 a ton, and I know that I can reduce my emissions by $1,000 a ton by investing in some pollution abatement, then I'm going to invest in that pollution abatement. I'm then going to go sell on the open market these permits for $5,000 a ton and make a $4,000 per ton profit. And so these forces of supply and demand lead the kind of the clearing price in these permit markets to tell us something about the marginal cost of abatement for firms in these regions. And then that's going to allow us to measure the marginal cost of compliance for different pollutants in different locations in different years and compare them to the marginal benefits of that same unit of emissions reductions that differ by pollutant and location and year. And then we can ask ourselves, is it the case that an additional unit of pollution reduction in, say, the Bay Area, are the cost of those regulations or that reduction much larger than the benefits, or vice versa? And that's really the comparison that we're going to be making in this paper. Okay, so just to give you a preview of what we find in our data is that we see that regulation in most markets seems to be too lenient. Basically, the benefits of 1 ton of emissions reductions in most every market in the United States are way larger than the cost, the compliance cost. But there are certain exceptions. If you look at Houston, for example, the market for VOCs, it's extraordinarily expensive for firms to reduce a ton of VOC emissions in Houston relative to the benefit it conveys to the residents in and around Houston in terms of improved air quality, reductions in mortality and reductions in morbidity. I'm also going to show you that these prices have been increasing rapidly in real terms over the past 30 years, something between 6 to 9% annually. And so that means that basically the regulatory or compliance costs that these firms face, firms that emit criteria air pollutants, have been doubling about every 10 years. And so while the conclusions today suggest that regulations seem to be too lenient, this could rapidly change given the trajectories that we observe in our data in terms of compliance costs. I'll probably skip over this, but we also in the paper compare our estimates of marginal compliance cost or marginal abatement cost to the EPA's own internal engineering estimates that they have using a software platform that they developed. And we show that there's very large discrepancies between what we'd call our revealed preference estimates of marginal compliance cost when we compare them to the EPA's engineering estimates. And there's lots of reasons why. We've spoken to lots of regulators and EPA officials to try to determine where these discrepancies exist. But it just, I think, is a little bit of maybe a wake-up call or a warning to us and to EPA officials that the existing technology for thinking about cost-benefit analysis using these engineering models may be a little bit misguided. And at the very end, we talk about different regulatory instruments and whether or not we could improve welfare or improve policy by changing the regulatory instrument that we're using. So right now, the regulatory instrument that we're using is a cap. It's a quantity instrument. We basically say, well, when we go into non-attainment, we're going to cap the level of emissions, and then we're going to let firms trade under that cap. But a different policy instrument would be a price regulation, like a tax, where we tax firms annually on the damages associated with their emissions. And in the presence of uncertainty, those two instruments are actually different and lead to different expected welfare gains. And what I'm going to show you, if I have time at the end, is that it seems like we might be better off switching from this cap to a tax. And that has to do with the steepness of the marginal abatement cost curve and some theory developed by Marty Weitzman in the late 70s or mid to late 70s. Okay, so what we think is really the novelty of this project is to gather data and develop a method to measure the marginal cost of pollution abatement that differs by pollutant and location and year. And certainly there have been studies out there that estimate the total cost of, say, things like the Clean Air Act, but the total costs don't really tell us much about further regulations or the efficiency of existing regulations, because when we're thinking about efficiency, we need to think about incremental changes or the benefits at the margin. And estimating marginal cost is a lot more difficult. And so there's some researchers out there that if you say tried to estimate marginal cost for particular markets, like the SO2 trading program, for example, but there's no studies out there to our knowledge that are able to estimate or have estimated marginal cost of compliance that differ by pollutant and location and year, which is what our study attempts to do. Okay, so Two clarifications that I want to talk about before diving into the data. When we talk about efficiency here, efficiency is a word, in economics when we think about cost effectiveness. And so when I use efficient, I'm thinking about what's the right level of air pollution that maximizes the pie of total welfare in society, the sum of consumer and producer surplus, or what makes us the most well off for the least amount of cost. In the paper, we talk about what might be optimal from the standpoint of instrument choice. That's a little bit different when we can choose between price and quantity instruments. We're thinking about efficiency, like a constrained notion of efficiency. We have this crazy policy, the Clean Air Act, that in many ways economists hate because there's lots of things that are not cost effective in the Clean Air Act. But what we're trying to do is say within the existing regulatory infrastructure of the Clean Air Act, is it the case that regulations are too stringent or not stringent enough? The second thing I want to say is that I've talked a lot so far about the cost and marginal cost of compliance and said that we need to compare them to the marginal benefits of emissions reductions that differ by pollutant and location and year. And what we're doing for the marginal benefits and the way that we're going to estimate marginal benefits of improved air quality or reductions in emissions, the way that we do that is by taking existing estimates off the shelf from leading researchers in this space. So what we're going to do is use an air quality model that was developed by some economists called AP3. We use a bunch of other models as well to validate these estimates. And what these estimates deliver are the benefits of, say, 1 ton of particulate emissions reductions in different regions of the United States. And so then we can compare those benefits, which are measured in terms of reductions in mortality and reductions in morbidity. We can compare those benefits of those emissions reductions to our estimates of the compliance cost of those same 1 ton of emissions reductions and just ask whether or not they're equal or whether or not they're different. Okay, so I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about these pollution offset markets because they're very important and relatively, I'd say, less well understood or well known compared to some of the more prominent, say, cap and trade emissions trading programs like California's cap and trade program or the Reclaim program in the South Coast, or some of the other emissions trading programs that exist in the United States or around the world. But they're super important for stationary source emissions in the United States. So as I alluded to earlier, the 1970 Clean Air Act amendments basically designated these national ambient air quality standards that required certain regions to meet these standards, and those requirements were enforced or put into place by air quality monitors in these regions. So if an air quality monitor exceeds one of the regulatory standards, then that region is designated as non-attainment. Non-attainment means that any new entrant in that area has to fully offset their emissions 1 for 1 by finding a willing counterparty to reduce their emissions permanently. These offset markets there have been some changes to them over time, but really starting with the 1977 Clean Air Act amendments and certainly the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments, these offset markets have become more standardized, and there have been things put into place to make them slightly more transparent by establishing inventories for people like me, the steel plant. If I want to locate in Berkeley, I know I can go on to the EPA or the Bay Area Air Quality Management District's website and find out who's willing to sell me these permits tomorrow. So how does this work in practice? I've given a few toy examples, but this is really from the EPA's manual, if you will. And it's talking about how these offset markets work and how you comply with them. So it says available ERCs attract new firms. ERCs are emissions reduction credits or offsets. There's synonyms, so you might hear me say either. So in this example, we have an existing firm, an incumbent, that emits 200 tons per year, but it found out that it could buy some pollution abatement equipment over there for $100 a ton, and decides to invest in that pollution abatement equipment and reduces their emissions from 200 tons per year to 60 tons per year. So they've permanently reduce their emissions by 140 tons per year, they take that to the regulator and say, look, what we did, we installed this technology. Engineers come out and verify that that technology, in fact, reduces their emissions to 60 tons per year. The EPA or the local air regulators will then issue a certificate, an ERC certificate of 140 tons per year that they can sell in the open market. And in this case, they sell it to firm B for $150 a ton, and they've made a $50 per ton profit. This is what this data actually looks like in practice. This is an example of one of these transactions in Houston. So this is ScanPack, a Houston manufacturing plant. It built a thermal oxidizer. It reduced their emissions of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, by 22 tons. It then sold this offset to Enterprise Products, an oil company, for $3.6 million. So these are the types of transactions and prices that we're going to be using to measure the marginal compliance cost. And then we're going to compare them to the benefits that differ by pollutant and location and year. So when we think about the overall market structure and market design of these programs, you should think about really there being demand and supply floating around in the background. Demand for these offsets comes from new entrants or expanding facilities that need to offset their expanded emissions. And the supply comes from the incumbents being the stationary sources or factories that exist in these non-attainment regions that are willing to permanently reduce their emissions and then sell these emissions rights on the open market. Now, there are certainly frictions in these markets that I think are important to be aware of. A lot of the transactions in these markets are brokered through third-party brokerages. And we expect there to be some important intermediation cost that some brokers have talked to us about being between 5 and 25% of the transaction cost. Other concerns that you might have are that firms may try to exert some form of market power in these markets. So if I'm an incumbent, I'm not going to sell, like maybe I don't want to sell my emissions rights to some competitor that's going to compete with me. And so I'm going to withhold supply and drive up the permit price to scare away entry. We've done a lot of work to try to understand market power in these markets and have come to the conclusion that there does seem to be a lot of market power because there's a lot of latent supply for these permits. So, you know, if you withhold supply, then the person next door would be happy to sell to that steel plant that wants to locate in these regions, for example. So the pollutants that we're going to study today, as I mentioned, are criteria air pollutants. These are local air pollutants. Basically, they don't travel super far in terms of where they go, and they damage, they lead to air quality reductions and health damages relatively locally. You know, this is different than greenhouse gas emissions, which we think of as a global pollutant. It doesn't really matter where you emit a greenhouse gas emission because it's just going to uniformly mix in the atmosphere. In this case, it actually matters where you emit these pollutants because they don't travel all that far. And so what that means is that these damages are going to be very specific to where these pollution emissions are emitted. So for example, if you emit a ton of particulate matter in the middle of the Nevada desert, the damages are not going to be that large because no one lives, or very few people live in the middle of the Nevada desert. Conversely, if you emit a ton of pollution emissions in Manhattan, that's going to lead to much larger damages because that air pollution emissions are going to affect many more people. And so when we think about efficiency or optimality of these regulations, we need to recognize that damages are going to be very different depending on where you emit the pollution, and the cost of compliance are probably going to differ by location and by pollutant and by year. And so what efficiency requires when we think about are these regulations too stringent or not stringent enough is comparing the benefits and cost in these specific markets to each other. So we're going to study nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. These are precursors to ozone formation. And some of the, and then in some analysis, we're going to focus on particulate matter as well, but there are fewer transactions and fewer non-attainment areas for particulate matter relative to ozone non-attainment regions, which are fairly ubiquitous. The data that we're going to use comes from 16 states and the future state of Washington, D.C. California and Texas have very rich publicly available data that you can download and use. Texas has even more detailed data that has seller and buyer identities in these transactions, whereas California typically just provides the price of the transaction, but not the counterparties. That's going to allow us to dig in a little bit deeper in some of these Texas markets relative to what we can do in other states. The other data we bought from brokerages. In fact, one of the largest brokers in this market sold us a lot of data that we use on the 14 other states in our sample. So there are 550 markets for there's basically 556 pollution offset markets in the United States today. As I suggested, that about 60% of the US population lives in one of these markets. There are 304 markets for ozone, 104 markets for particulate matter, and 86 other markets for other pollutants that are regulated, like sulfur dioxide or carbon monoxide. This is a figure kind of showing you where those markets are. They're typically in more densely populated areas where these populated areas are in non-attainment or in violation of the Clean Air Act's national ambient air quality standards for ozone or particulate matter. Now, one thing that's kind of in the weeds of the study that is just important to point out is that these offset transaction prices are transaction prices that reflect the right to emit 1 ton of emissions permanently. The estimates of the marginal benefits of an emissions reduction that we use from the literature are annual benefits. And so to compare apples to apples, we need to convert these permanent rights to an annual, like rental rate, if you will. And the way that we do that is by applying a ratio of what the permanent price is relative to the 1-year price and convert all our permanent transactions to 1-year rental rates, where we can compare the annual cost or compliance cost to the annual benefit to set up these tests. Okay, so the marginal benefits of abatement or the marginal benefits of pollution reduction, as I said, comes from other researchers. We deliberately didn't really want to innovate in this space. And so we're taking existing air quality models off the shelf. Probably the most prominent and well-known, at least within the economics community, is AP3. AP3 is a model, it's an integrated assessment model that basically tells a researcher or user, if you were to reduce emissions of particulate matter by 1 ton, say in LA, what are the total benefits of that emissions reductions as measured by improvements in health and well-being? Fortunately for us, you can do that for any pollutant regulated under the Clean Air Act and for any location. And so that allows us to get damages of pollution emissions or benefits of pollution reductions that differ by pollutant and location and year. And this map shows you what those benefits look like. As I alluded to before, the benefits are going to be of emissions reductions are going to be largest in places where lots of people live, and they're going to be relatively smaller in places where not many people live, because pollution emissions will convey in more rural areas will affect fewer people relative to more densely populated areas. And lastly, as I alluded to before, we have estimates from engineering models on the engineering abatement cost that comes from the EPA's what's called control strategy tool. This is a tool that regulators and the EPA use for cost benefit analyses, prospective or retrospective evaluations of either new air quality regulations or existing air quality regulations. The way that this data works is that they have an inventory for every plant in their data. They know what the existing abatement technologies are that are installed in that plant. And they know, or at least claim to know, what other opportunities might exist for that plant that can further reduce their emissions and what the cost of those emissions reductions are. So in this case, we have international paper. They emit nitrogen dioxide 177 tons per year. There exists a control technology out there, selective catalytic reductions, that can reduce their emissions by 75% at a cost per ton of $1,300. And that would cost them $175,000 per year if they were to install it. So that's how this data works. This is a huge data set. You know, it has information for every single plant and for every single pollutant, but requires a lot of the regulator too, in knowing everything that's been installed in that plant and all the technologies that may be available to that plant. Okay, I'll skip over the details of how we think about interpreting offset prices, because I think the intuition should be fairly straightforward, especially for people who've thought a little bit about emissions trading markets and how the market clearing price tells us a lot about what the marginal cost of abatement are for firms. So with that, I just want to dive into some of the results. And here I just want to highlight kind of the more aggregate high-level set of results that we have in our project. So if you just focus on column 1 for nitrogen dioxide emissions, the first row of the first column is telling us the ratio of the offset prices to the marginal benefits of abatement. And if regulation was just right, that ratio should be 1. In this case, the ratio is far below 1. And so what this means is that the marginal cost of compliance are way below the marginal benefits of 1 ton of emissions reduction. In fact, you can see that on the subsequent lines. When you think about the marginal cost of compliance with these regulations on average in the US for nitrogen dioxide, it's $2,400. The marginal benefit of 1 ton of emissions reductions for nitrogen dioxide in these markets on average is about $40,000 a ton. So if we were to further ratchet down nitrogen dioxide emissions, we'd be getting a lot of benefit, $40,000 relative to the cost of $2,000. Now, the same could be said for VOCs. The cost of reducing pollution emissions on average by 1 ton for VOCs is $2,800. The benefits we as society receive on average from that same unit of emissions reduction is about $20,000 per ton, suggesting that these air quality regulations are not stringent enough. They could be further ratcheted down. We would receive lots of benefits relative to the cost. Now, one of the cool things about this project is that we can do things not necessarily nationally, we can do them regionally. We can also do them by market. So if we go to the Northeast, looking at column 1, here we see that the benefits of reducing 1 ton of nitrogen dioxide in the Northeast, about $45,000, and the cost of reducing nitrogen dioxide emissions by 1 ton is only $550. Similarly for VOCs, $29,000 a ton in benefits, $600 a ton in cost. We could further ratchet down regulations in these areas and have lots of benefits relative to the cost. And then in the South, things are a little bit different. The costs are a little bit larger and the benefits are a little bit smaller, but these benefit cost ratios are still favorable on the margin. And then there's differences in the West and differences in the Midwest. But on average, at least at the regional level, it seems to be the case that regulations seem to be not stringent enough. Now, as I said before, we can actually go in each specific market and look at the cost relative to the benefits on the margin. And so what this is showing in red are the marginal benefits of abatement, so the marginal benefits of 1 ton of emissions reductions. And then the blue dots show us the marginal cost of emissions reductions. And what you see is that the red is always to the right of the blue for the markets in our data, suggesting that for NOx emissions, the benefits far exceed the cost. And for VOCs, that same story seems to be the case, with one kind of counterexample being Houston down at the bottom, where you see the blue dot, the compliance cost seems to be above the marginal benefits of the ton of VOC reduction in Houston. So Margaret asked a question about how these benefits are valued, whether or not these VOC emissions, are they the direct damages associated with breathing volatile organic compounds, or do they account for the damages associated with ozone formation? And it's the latter. So the damages associated with at least these air quality models that we're using calculate the total damages associated with ozone formation and subsequent mortality and morbidity increases, as well as secondary PM as far as I can tell in these models. Of course, this is, these models, to be clear, it's a pretty heroic task. And I think that there's still a fair amount of uncertainty in these models and improvements that can be made. And in many ways, that's why we deliberately didn't dive in head first and really tried to just take existing peer-reviewed work off the shelf and then compare them to our estimates of marginal compliance cost. Okay, so this is just showing you in numbers what those figures showed you before. We do a lot of sensitivity analyses in our data, trying to understand how our conclusions may differ if we use different assumptions or look at different years. And nothing really overturns the headline conclusions from the standpoint of regulation seems to be too lenient in most of the markets that we study. There's also things that you can do in the integrated assessment models in terms of calculating benefits. For example, there are different dose response functions that researchers use or the EPA uses for cost benefit analyses. Those dose response functions or concentration response functions lead to different damage estimates. So we've kind of recalculated the benefits of a ton of emissions reductions using different estimates of the value of a statistical life, for example, or different concentration response functions from the literature. And none of these seem to really overturn or change the conclusions in this study. The next thing I want to talk about is just what has been happening to these prices over time. So one thing that's certain, and you can see this by just looking at this graph, I'll spend a minute or two talking about it, is that areas that have been in non-attainment for long periods of time, places like LA, in some cases Houston, those places have really exhausted a lot of the low-hanging fruit associated with abatement. And as a result, the cost of compliance in those markets is much larger or higher than places that, for example, just newly found themselves in non-attainment. So what this graph is showing you on the x-axis is the number of years that a different region has been in non-attainment, ranging from 0 to 27. And then on the y-axis is the offset price. And it's just showing you that there's a very strong correlation between how long you've been in non-attainment and the average offset price in those regions. And the intuition is, at least that we have, comes from what I just described, in that a lot of the low-hanging abatement opportunities in LA have already been exhausted, and additional abatement that occurs in LA tends to be much more expensive. Yana asked an interesting question about break-even values of VSLs and other forms of thinking about how large does the how large does the value of a statistical life have to be, or how small does the value of a statistical life have to be to overturn some of these conclusions? In the paper, we did that, I think, and to try to understand, like, if we say, the existing VSL or value of a statistical life that the EPA uses is something like $8 million, between $6 and $8 million. What would be the value that would lead this benefit cost ratio to 1? And it'd be something like $1 million or something, I think, is what on average we came up with, which is much below what I think a lot of the existing researchers think the VSL estimates should be. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty in VSL in terms of what it captures and how to measure it, but that's something that we engage with a little bit. But the literature on VSL is certainly contentious, and I think that there's a lot more that could be done in terms of thinking about different VSLs in terms of quality adjusted life years, who's being affected, so on and so forth, that we're not going to try to innovate or haven't done much on in the paper. This table is just showing you on average how much these prices have been increasing over time in real terms. So all these prices have been deflated by effectively the CPI. And this is just showing you the annual growth rate in these prices over time. As I said, that range between 6 and 9%. And at that rate of growth, that suggests that these compliance costs, these marginal abatement costs, would actually double in scope over as short of a 10-year horizon. And so while it seems to be the case that these regulations are too lenient, if these price increases continue as they have been, then those results might be quite a bit different in the future. In the interest of time, I'll just say that when we compare engineering to our estimates, engineering costs to our estimates of marginal compliance costs, they differ a lot. Sometimes they're too high, sometimes they're too low. And there's lots of different reasons for that. Partly because I think engineering estimates miss lots of other forms of economic cost. For one, it's also the case that a lot of the data that goes into these engineering estimates is, to use the direct words that came from the EPA regulators that use this data, bad. They don't have very detailed information on the compliance technologies that might exist for these plants, nor do they actually know whether or not these compliance technologies that they think might exist would actually work given the production processes used in these plants. And so it tends to be a lot more speculative in nature. So just to say that the engineering costs and economic costs tend to differ as quite a bit. The last thing I'll say, and this is just is quite a bit more speculative, but also just to show you some more data and what we can do with the data. So this is just showing you a time series of these permit prices for nitrogen dioxide in Houston over time. So you'll see the black represents the average and the blue bars represent the interquartile range within a given year of these transaction prices. The red line corresponds to the marginal benefit of 1 ton of nitrogen dioxide emissions reductions in Houston. And what you'll see here is that in the early 2000s, these permit prices were trading for like $1,000 or $2,000 a ton. And then basically after 2012, they spiked to about $22,000 a ton. This is even more salient for VOCs in Houston, where they were trading for about $100 to $200 to $500 a ton. And then all of a sudden it went to about $25,000 a ton. Now, just talking to regulators and brokers in this market is a very clear explanation as to why the introduction of natural gas fracturing or fracking in the West Permian Basin and the demand for refinery capacity in Houston led to huge demand for VOC emissions offset permits. To expand refinery capacity in Houston, you have to fully offset your emissions. So all of a sudden there was a lot of demand and that led the price to spike quite a bit in these markets. And what that suggests is that as demand shifts out, the supply for abatement is relatively inelastic in the short run. So we have a very steep marginal abatement cost curve that's leading to these wild price spikes. So if we go back to Marty Weitzman's seminal paper in the 1970s, if you have a relatively flat marginal benefit curve and a very steep marginal abatement cost curve, when we think about instrument choice between a cap versus a tax, so a quantity instrument versus a price instrument, if it's the case that we have a very steep marginal abatement cost curve and a relatively flat marginal benefit curve, a price mechanism could lead to welfare improvements relative to the existing quantity mechanism. And so all we're trying to say here is that at least in the short to medium run, it looks like these marginal abatement cost curves are very, very steep, because when demand shifts out, prices rise rapidly and dramatically. So in that case, the regulator might consider changing from the existing quantity instrument to a price instrument. This has parallels to what some people in the policy space have seen in cap and trade markets, where we have these price collars, the upper and lower floors for, say, the California Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Program. So that's like a hybrid instrument, a quantity and a price instrument. But in any case, it does seem to be the case that the marginal abatement cost curve, at least speculatively, tends to be very steep in these markets. Okay. In the remaining minutes, I want to talk about this other companion paper that uses this data and these offset transaction prices to focus more on equity considerations. So everything I've talked about thus far is really focused on efficiency or cost effectiveness. Are we regulating too much or not enough? But when you start looking at and thinking about these transactions that occur, there may be equity considerations that also arise. So just to be very salient, you could imagine one of these plants in these communities permanently reduces their emissions, and then they sell them to another plant in a different neighborhood or different community that permanently increases their emissions. And so in that way, with these permit data, you can track where emissions are moving, and we can just ask very simple questions whether or not emissions trades in these offset markets are moving pollution to or away from disadvantaged communities. And so that's what we try to do in this companion paper. There's lots of reasons why that's an important and salient issue today, certainly from the standpoint of environmental justice and advocates for environmental justice. There's been a little bit of a tension between environmental justice advocates and market-based advocates, where environmental justice advocates are typically coming out in favor or against market-based instruments because they may exacerbate existing inequality and air pollution exposures. And that's certainly possible. And what we're trying to do here is just use some data to just ask whether or not these trades, at least in the data that we have, are doing that. So the way that we're going to do that is by relying on a subset of the data that we were using in the previous project that has information on the buyer and seller engaged in these transactions. So as I alluded to earlier, that data really exists mainly in Texas. We were able to get it also in the San Joaquin Valley in the South Coast Air District in California. But as far as we know, we don't know of other data in the US. I'm sure it exists with judicious FOIA request, but we have not yet been able to get buyer and seller information on these transactions for different regions. So we're going to focus on 12 offset markets in 2 states where we know the buyer and we know the seller, we know where they're located. And then we're going to compare the community characteristics surrounding those facilities and just ask whether or not those community characteristics from the American Community Survey, things like the proportion African American, the proportion Latino, or the average income differ from origin to destination facility, and just asking whether or not these trades are exacerbating or ameliorating environmental inequality concerns. So in terms of the demographic data, what we do is, so like I said, we know exactly where these facilities are located in these 12 markets. And then we just draw like a little circle, a 1-mile buffer around these factories, and calculate using the American Community Survey, basically publicly available demographic data, the share Black, share Hispanic, and the median income in these communities, and then compare the selling plants to the buying plants and ask whether or not they're different. So this is really kind of the a summary figure for the share of, let me just take a step back and say, there's a lot going on in this figure. So let's take some time to unpack and figure out what this is showing us. So This is a kernel density plots, or think about it as the distribution of different communities surrounding these facilities. So if you just focus on the red line, you'll see that a majority of the communities in our data have fairly low African American population shares. That's why this red line, it spikes over here at like 0.05. So on average, the average community surrounding one of these facilities have about 5% of the African American population. So the red line is showing us where these expansions occurred, and the blue line is or where these emissions expansions occurred, and the blue line is showing us the community characteristics where these permanent emissions reductions occurred. And so what you see, and the way to interpret this graph is to say that a lot of the emissions reductions occurred in these communities that were between 20 and 40% African American. And they reallocated pollution primarily to communities that were much less African American, at least as measured in the American Community Survey. Now, so that, but on average, that these vertical lines are showing that the average characteristic or the average fraction of African Americans in these communities didn't change much between these transactions. This is the Latino population share. And so we can spend a few minutes talking about what this figure shows us. It shows us that majority of the emissions reductions occurred in predominantly Latino areas or very non-Latino areas, and traded them towards communities that were between 20 and 40% Latino. So on average, the fraction Hispanic increases as a result of these transactions in our data, just a little bit, but not statistically different from zero. This is showing you median household income. And what this is showing you is that a majority of the emissions reductions occurred in relatively poorer places, and emissions rights were traded to relatively wealthier communities on average. So the average household income in these expanding facilities, the facilities that are now emitting pollution for the first time, tends to go up. So we're trading pollution to relatively wealthier communities, at least in our data for the 12 markets that we have. So in the paper, we do statistical test asking whether or not these means are statistically different from one another. Is it the case that the the median household incomes differ statistically from origin to destination? And I don't think that there's a single characteristic in the data that we observe where we can reject the null hypothesis that they're equal. So we don't have enough statistical power or precision, for example, to suggest that these markets are reallocating pollution disproportionately to lower income or higher income, or disproportionately Black or disproportionately Latino communities. Okay. One thing that I'll just conclude with that I think is important in this debate and discussion is that there have been lots of papers out there exploring the equity implications of environmental markets. And what I want to just leave you with is that there's no answer, there's no right answer to this question. Every market is going to be very, very different. And what you want to know from a prospective situation, whether or not, if we were to move to a new market or introduce a new market, whether or not that's going to lead to unequal outcomes. What you really need to know is the spatial distribution of abatement cost in that region or in that area. The reason for that is the plants that have very, very high abatement cost are not going to abate pollution, and they're just going to buy permits and emit pollution. Places with plants with very low abatement cost are going to abate and sell their permits on the open market. And so inequality or equity considerations in these markets really comes down to the spatial distribution of marginal abatement costs in these markets. If it's the case that all of the high abatement cost facilities are in low income or minority or disadvantaged communities, it is the case that environmental markets will lead to unequal outcomes and vice versa. So I think we need more studies to try to think about the equity considerations of environmental markets. But really, if we want to do prospective evaluations of whether or not environmental markets are going to lead to unequal outcomes, we really need to know about the spatial distribution of marginal abatement cost and how they correlate with community characteristics. And that's hard to do. It's hard to measure abatement cost for specific facilities. Okay, so with that, I'll wrap up and just say that when we think about the efficiency of the existing US air quality regulations, it seems to be that regulations are too lenient. We could get lots of benefits relative to the compliance cost. And then on the equity considerations of these actual permit trades, it doesn't seem like these transactions, at least in the limited 12 markets that we can observe in California and Texas, are disproportionately relocating emissions towards minority or disadvantaged or lower income communities. Although again, those conclusions certainly may not apply in other contexts. And really every environmental market is going to be very different, and it hinges crucially on where different facilities are located, what their marginal abatement costs are, and so on and so forth. So I'm happy to answer questions if anybody has any. But other than that, I appreciate you guys sticking around and listening to this talk.
So I'd like to thank Reed again. Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation and all this work. Just looking at this looks like a considerable amount of work, and I want to thank you and Joe for doing this and then sharing it with us. So now I'd like to open up the floor to questions for the next 10 minutes. So if you have a question, could you just say I have a question in the chat, and then I'll take those questions in order. I'll call out your name, and then you can ask your question just over voice. So please, if you have any questions, I have a few questions teed up just in case nobody has a question, but but please go ahead. And I'll keep an eye on the chat. So I'll start with a question about the second study that you've been looking at, thinking about equity. Oh, okay. So Yana has a question. So I'll ask my question, and then Yana, I guess, will ask hers. So you're looking at shares of different communities. Have you looked at whether pollution is shifted to more populated areas? Is that a possibility? Because I mean, these markets might be fairly large. Could pollution be moving from? Yeah.
No, the total blind spot on our part that we haven't done that, but that's certainly super important. If it's a case that the share is small, but the number is huge, then that would be important to consider and think about. And that's not something that we had done before. So thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah. So Yana has a question. I'll call on Yana, and then after that, Jeremy has a question.
Hello, Reed. Thank you for your presentation. I'm a postdoc and colleague with Dave. My question, I guess, is more philosophical, on the second study. Right now, most of the equity discussions of this type of work focus on, for example, the community characteristics. But are you aware of any other, also interesting indicators? Regarding this research, I'm thinking, is it a good thing for new firms to enter historically, more highly polluted places, or is it better to move away from those historically more prolonged, highly emitting areas? And it could be a good strategy to have some zones to collect high emitting firms together and to mitigate them all together. So this also complicates the equity consideration. Not sure if my question is clear enough.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think it's a question that I think lots of people struggle with. I mean, I would say that I think the impetus for zoning regulations and other things that have existed in the past is to try to concentrate some of these industrial activities in certain locations. Whether or not that makes sense from an equity consideration, I mean, I think that there's a lot of work to suggest that zoning has led and potentially exacerbated inequality. And there's lots of things that happen in the background too, in terms of how these communities change over time. On the other end of things, New Jersey, for example, just had a pretty groundbreaking environmental justice policy that they put into place, I think, that passed the legislature and was signed by the governor, that basically limited, banned these transactions, the ones that we were just talking about and studying, from moving pollution to minority communities. So if it's the case that you're a plant and want to locate in one of these minority communities, the New Jersey law now forbids that from happening. So that's a very blunt policy instrument, but certainly I think many environmental justice advocates are in favor of, given the existing disparities that already exist in these communities to begin with.
Yeah, thank you.
So Jeremy, you're up.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the talk, Reid. It was super interesting. My question actually very similar to Jana's. It was just really in thinking about, cumulative impact and the interest of developing metrics that kind of better represent that, and kind of looking at shares of population by race or other things maybe don't get to that as much as looking at layered indices. So like, I'm sure you've thought about this, but using the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index or other ones that also bring in stuff about access to transportation or other elements that speak better to kind of, I guess, like baseline vulnerability, and how impacts could be worse on communities that are already stressed across multiple different dimensions. So just wondering how much you've thought about that. And
yeah, I mean, I think regulators have thought about it more than I have, to be honest. If you look at in California, but also in New Jersey, there's a very precise definition of what disadvantaged is, and it incorporates lots of things. It's not just whether or not you've been disproportionately exposed to criteria or toxic air pollutants or proximity to highways, but incorporates other aspects of social disadvantage. So in that sense, it seems like regulator, I don't know if they're one step ahead, but certainly have thought about what constitutes disadvantage. And yeah, I mean, I want to highlight and be upfront about what we were doing in this companion project is certainly just looking at 1 or 2 or 3 pollutants, and not saying much about what the existing disparities are, nor recognizing that there are lots of other pollutants out there, toxic pollutants that are emitted or hazardous air pollutants that are emitted, that are much less well known or monitored as well. But I think to the extent that the concerns of the environmental justice community are certainly valid and real, and these burdens add up, and so I think it is important to be much more holistic about when we're talking about environmental inequality than focusing on a single pollutant, for example.
I agree. Yeah, thank you.
I have a few more questions personally, but I want to make sure that people know that the floor is open if you have another question. So I will ask. Let's see. So your finding from the first paper is that the cap is fairly loose. Is that a accurate? Like the cap is not stringent enough. If the cap was more stringent, then you would have the marginal abatement costs would be higher, right? For firms potentially.
I think
that's right.
That's one way to think about it. Yeah, and in fact, sorry, Dave, I didn't want. You should ask the question. Was there a question or?
Oh no, please. Okay. So I was. The question was more. I have a few questions about logistics of the program, because the cap is set by some. I'm not sure how the cap is set exactly, and if the cap is adjusted at any point. Is it the Clean Air Act amendments that kind of regulate that in each market?
Yeah, it's very different than I think that the cap and trade programs that we're more familiar with, like the SO2 trading program, for example. The cap is really just, you can think about it as like a cap on, like a snapshot of a point in time. So when non-attainment happens, basically the EPA freezes permit issuances of any new facility that wants to locate in those regions, unless they can find a willing counterparty to permanently reduce their emissions. So it's not like in the SOT trading program, which basically says this is the total amount of pollution that we're going to allow each year, and then we're going to slowly ratchet that down. This is basically saying we're just going to stop letting people enter, and the cap is basically what happened yesterday, and we're going to hopefully, by forcing firms to install new firms to install expensive abatement technologies, come back into compliance. Now, there is the case that in some of these regions, some of these markets, if you're very, very far out of attainment, so there's different gradations of attainment for certain pollutants. You can be extreme non-attainment or moderate or marginal or severe, especially for ozone, I think. So if you're in extreme non-attainment, they institute trading ratios. So to further reduce emissions from the baseline. So if it's the case, so imagine a trading ratio in an extreme case of like 1.5 to 1. So if I'm a new entrant, I have to buy 150 tons if I'm going to emit 100 tons to further incentivize emissions reductions. And that's something, you know, from a policy perspective, if you take these results literally, would be a good thing from the standpoint of it seems like we're getting a lot more bang for the buck, and we could further ratchet things down, make the cap more binding, lower the ceiling, and get additional benefits.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think Margaret McAllister has a question. I will open. Well, I guess she can unmute.
Yeah, I can unmute. My question was just about the non-attainment. I was wondering if for that cap, does the EPA take into account, you know, for example, wildfires, which are huge emitters of NOx and VOCs. So how does that cap adjust in the event where there's, you know, a force of nature that puts California or some other region out of attainment when it's not actually the polluter's fault?
This is a super important question and increasingly important. The answer is pretty unsatisfying to me, at least. And right now, as the Clean Act is currently written, the EPA excludes what are known as exceptional events from their non-attainment designations. So if it were the case that a wildfire, for example, set off the NOx, VOC, or PM monitors and made that area non-compliant or in non-attainment, that local air region could lobby, or not really lobby, but just advocate saying this is an exceptional event. It was a wildfire that triggered these things. The reason I find that unsatisfying, and so then they wouldn't be subject to the non-attainment designations, and they wouldn't be subject to the cap and so on and so forth. The reason that's unsatisfying is because, I mean, there's been recent work coming out of people like Marshall Burke at Stanford and Jim Burney and UC San Diego and others have suggested that an increasing fraction of particulate emissions in particular come from wildfires. And if we just continue to ignore them in the way that we set policy and air quality policy, then we're not, you know, air quality actually could probably get worse because we're taking that out of the menu of policy. I mean, we're basically just ignoring 60% or 70% of precursor emissions or that come from wildfires, especially in California and the Western United States. But it's tricky. It's it's something that's accidental, then all of a sudden squeezes a lot of stationary sources in these markets. And so there's definitely a lot of political economy or politics involved in how we think about wildfire emissions and how to regulate accordingly.
So Maria Harris has a question.
Thank you. Thanks. So my question was about the point you were making at the end about how every market is different and there's sort of no right answer to this question about how trading markets may influence distribution of pollution and equity, and that it's sort of a market specific question. And that was something that had had really jumped out to me from reading your paper. And I noted that you talked about also how averages can obscure the differences of individual, or obscure the experiences of individual communities. And, even if we don't see inequity being driven on average by these trading markets, there may be certain communities that are worse off and see that as resulting from the trading markets, which would be accurate based on your analysis. And you at the end of the talk sort of pointed to what sounded like a potential policy recommendation of evaluating the spatial distribution of potential abatement costs regionally. And I wonder if you have sort of further thoughts on how that could be implemented to sort of prospectively try to project what equity impacts might be of a new market and potentially build in additional policy mechanisms that could be targeted at avoiding increases in pollution in already disproportionately burdened areas.
Yeah, it's a great question. And so I want to say two things. One is I do think it's very hard for researchers or policymakers to know what marginal abatement costs are for every given facility or for a given number of facilities. So that's hard, period. We can think about ways to go about trying to incentivize or reveal that information from firms. I mean, we could ask it. They may have an incentive to say that it's very high so that they derive some sympathy from regulators or from the public. I don't know the answer and how to come up with good estimates. In the paper, we kind of heroically suggest that we can use these offset prices as measures of facility-specific marginal abatement costs, but those offset prices only exist for a subset of plants in the community, and they don't exist in areas that are in attainment, for example. So if you think about a prospective market that's going to operate in an attainment region, then we wouldn't even have these offset prices to begin with. So I don't know the answer to how we would do that in a clear and compelling way. The other thing I want to say is that this is why I think a lot of the environmental justice advocates, I mean, we're just kind of like are in favor of more prescriptive regulations that just mandate emissions reductions uniformly across the board, because we could think about these tweaks, prospective tweaks of like, okay, now we know that the spatial distribution looks unequal. Now we need to divide some little policy bumpers and guardrails to make sure that these markets don't exacerbate existing inequality, and so on and so forth. And we're just kind of like tying ourselves in knots relative to something that may be a bit more simpler to implement, maybe less cost effective, but may lead to better or more equal outcomes, which is just mandates or command and control type of prescriptive policies.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
So I have another question from Yana Jin.
Yes, I just noticed in the sensitivity analysis of the first study, and you show the impact of some other alternative estimates of the marginal benefits. And importantly, I noticed that when using InMap instead of AP3, for example, the ratio really becomes very close to 1, especially for VOC. That's not very straightforward. Could you explain a little bit there?
Yeah, I'll try. I mean, so for those not familiar, there are a handful of integrated assessment models out there that deliver benefits of emissions reductions that differ by pollutant and by location. So the one that we use predominantly in the study is AP3. This is an integrated assessment model that's been used by lots of researchers to study lots of different questions, at least in the economics community. There are other companion integrated assessment models out there, some of them more complicated, some of them less complicated. InMap is one that researchers have used, and then EASER or easier, depending on who you ask, is another one that people use. So we used all of these three just to consider sensitivity. I honestly didn't remember that things became so much closer to one when using Nmap for VOCs, but it is the case that VOCs in general, a lot of the VOC regulation is occurring in the Houston, Brazoria, Galveston, Texas area that has very, very high VOC prices. So if the benefits come down at all, you're going to be pretty close to one for VOCs regardless. And so I think another way of saying that is that Nmap has just has lower benefit estimates, at least in the Texas area relative to AP3. And so I haven't dug into the specifics, but one reason that could be the case, for example, is the different air quality dispersion models that are used in calculating these damages. So for example, east of Houston is the Gulf of Mexico. If you have an air transport model that takes all of that pollution and puts it out in the Gulf of Mexico, that's going to lead to much lower damages than if you have an air transport model that kind of keeps things stationary and in the Houston area. And so that could be one source of the difference, for example, is that AP3 tends to project that most of these emissions will move out into the Gulf of Mexico and thereby harm fewer people. At least that's how the damages are that are being currently calculated, versus Nmap, which maybe has a less aggressive forecast as to where these emissions are going to be transported.
Yes, I'm asking is because, like, based on my limited knowledge of these big models, Nmap has much higher population density resolution in their computation. And if that is the case, then it's still, I mean, if the key difference is the Nmap is better at capturing the population density differences, then why would we see the opposite as you shown in the sensitivity analysis? I guess that might we might leave that to more detailed discussion as it is quite technical. But yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
So I think Jamie Fine has a question.
Hi, Reed. Let me apologize for being late to the party today. I do kind of have a rule that I try to live by, and I'm violating now, which is, no investigation, no right to speak. And I haven't heard your presentation today. So I will humbly throw out a question based on just the statement I heard when I joined in, this idea that prescriptive command and control policies might be preferential in some cases. One thing we are grappling with in real time now is debating around date certain goals for the sale of medium and heavy duty trucks that are zero carbon, electric, perhaps hydrogen, and date certain for when the fleet on the road is zero carbon, electric or something else. And the reality of it is that if we were to politically accomplish one of those date certain goals for 100%, it's like 2040 or 2050, way out in the future, right? And if you engage communities and you were to ask them how they feel about that goal, they would say, that's way out in the future. My child will be 40 years old by then or 30 years old by then. So I'm just curious your thoughts on some of these prescriptive goals are very hard to get across the line and very far in the future and don't address real present concerns. Right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I want to highlight, so the study that, everything that I've talked about today is about stationary source emissions. But I think one of the real blind spots of the Clean Air Act as it currently exists is how relatively toothless it is on the mobile source side of things, especially when it comes to regional differentiation. So obviously the Clean Air Act has some ability to, the EPA has some ability with the national government to set fuel economy standards or emission standards for automobiles, but those typically apply nationally, or there's this California mandate that everyone's heard of or knows about. But the reality is that a lot of the existing problems in a lot of communities in the United States today don't necessarily come from stationary source emissions, they come from mobile source emissions. And it's very hard to deal with mobile source emissions without a much more granular mobile source stick, if you will, regulatory stick. So I'm very, I am very, I agree with what you said, and I'm very sympathetic to those community concerns because I do think that they really have their finger much more on the pulse of what's going on in their communities, which is mobile source emissions. And to deal with mobile source emissions in these ways, we're going to need a much more integrated and holistic approach to air quality regulations. That's going to require collaborations between not only local air regulators, but also municipalities, land use, people in charge of land use decisions, transport, and so on and so forth. California is starting to move that way a little bit. So Meredith Valley, David Woolley, and I have a recent article with the Brookings paper talking about California's AB 617 that some of you guys may be familiar with. It's a community-oriented program designed to address air quality in disadvantaged communities. And this program is very innovative from the standpoint of community members deciding where air quality regulations should come from. And it's also innovative from the standpoint of it being able to draw in lots of different constituents from the standpoint of local land use decisions, transportation decisions, stationary source, mobile source, and so on and so forth. It's much more wider in scope in terms of the menu of options that potentially exist for dealing with these regulations, more so than the Clean Air Act, which has really, I think, failed a lot of these communities.
Love that point, and you're reminding me that City of Santa Monica just established a zero emissions vehicle zone. Mm-hmm. That is a very prescriptive policy that is getting at the problem very directly, very quickly. Mm-hmm. But I hear you in terms of what you can do with the Clean Air. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
So I have another question, and this is probably a less well-formed question. Well, actually, I have two questions. One's a technical question. If firms leave one of these markets, do they get credits? Do you only get credits if you still exist after your reduction? So yep. I guess that's a very specific question.
No, it's important because so if a firm closes down, they have an asset. They can sell all their permits to some other counterparty. And in fact, a lot of the origination of these permits comes from plant shutdowns. So I think some firms don't even realize that. And so you have all these brokers kind of circling the dying facilities, trying to tell them that they have an asset that is valuable, extraordinarily valuable in some cases, and try to buy them off of distressed plants that are closing down. So yes, that is something that exists.
And then like a question following on from that, because I didn't know the answer. So now that I do, there's the third-party sellers they play a big role here. I mean, so when you see the seller of credits, do you actually see that it's a third party versus the original, or the origin of where the credits are generated?
Yeah, it differs by state. So some states might say that this has been a broker transaction. In some states, you can actually just follow the entire lineage of transactions from like firm to broker to firm and see everywhere that the property rights changed hands. That's the case for Texas, for example. So yeah, I feel like in the Texas data, something like 60 to 70% of transactions are brokered. And increasingly states are starting to post these inventories online, so effectively create their own clearinghouse and brokerage where, like I said, in California, I can just go on to the Air Quality Management District's website and it will tell me the firm, the contact information, and how much of each pollutant they have certified and for sale. So trying to provide a bit more liquidity and less opaqueness, I think, in these markets to make them function better.
Yeah, I was just curious because I know that at least in the work that I've looked at regarding like water markets where there's like permits created, you see these third-party sellers kind of grow up out of nowhere to do this arbitrage to try to like because they're good at keeping the transaction costs low. It's easier to find buyers and sellers if that's your job to do that. And if you know everyone, so
Definitely exists.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think yeah, it's really, really, really cool. So unless there's any other questions, so I want to thank you again. I want to make sure I probably don't have enough time to thank you appropriately. But thank you so much for presenting to us. I really I love your work. I'm going to be sharing your work with others and following your work pretty closely. And I also want to thank everybody at EDF for showing up. I know there's only a share of us here now, but I think it was really well received. And then I might ask if we have follow-up questions, if we're able to contact you. It can go through me or something like that.
Yeah,
but it could also, if individual folks. Okay, yeah. And then we've recorded this, so we're going to probably disseminate it within EDF. And probably not outside of it, but I think I confirmed with you that that was okay. And if it's not, please let me know. But again, this was great. And next month, for those that are still here, we're going to be having Meredith Fowley come in and talk. So I'm looking forward to next month. Okay,
that's great.
Great, and thank you, Hillary and Tocolo, for all the logistical help as well, setting this up. Okay, hope everybody has a great week. Thanks again, Reed.
Yep.